I'm nervous tonight almost like I was the first night, because today at lunch I went out to my pickup and sat in the pickup so I could be by myself just to read over things one more time. And it was either a flash of insight or a stroke. I'm not sure which. And it's going to show up later in the lesson, so you can decide if I need a pat on the back or medical attention. I'm not really sure. But we're here in chapter 11 of Revelation. It would have been really easy for me to read the last verse of 11 last time and start in chapter 12. It simply doesn't work that way because of the way these things are laid out. Chapters 1 through 11 really have shown us the difficulties of the church and difficulties that Christians will face, this ongoing battle between the church and the world. And I told you to begin with, the Revelation is going to show us that, and it's also going to show us a second battle. We've been looking at the battle between the citizens of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. Now, chapters 12 through 22 is really the second major division of the book. The book is split fairly evenly. And this is really showing us the broader battle between good and evil, between God and Satan. Now, both sections obviously show that the good will prevail, that God is faithful, that God is strong. So that theme has not changed. We're going to see things almost in more vivid color than we've even been seeing them to this point. But it is going to be describing the spiritual battle that's always been going on behind the scenes. This we're starting tonight is what I would call scene 4. And scene 4 itself is divided into 7 visions. I thought it was interesting. It's divided into 7 visions. Almost every commentary I read said that, but almost none of them agreed with each other on what the 7 visions were exactly. They just knew there had to be 7 in there, and they picked them out. But I'm not even going to talk about that until the end of next week when we finish up this scene 4. We're just going to be doing half of it. But as I said, I needed to start with 11 and 19, and let's read that one verse, and then I'll explain why. It says, "Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a great hailstorm." This is scene 4. Scenes 2 and 3 open with a view of the heavenly realms and thunder and lightning. They started the very same way. And so it seems to me that we have to back up and recognize this is where this particular vision or scene starts. These numbers were not given to us by the author. John didn't write a big number 12 there and then continue jotting things down. That's where we start. So now we're going to see this picture of the woman and the dragon. That's where we begin. Let's begin in chapter 12, verse 1. "A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days." The woman, it seems fairly clear when we look at the child and we get an idea and when we know what Revelation is about, our imaginations don't have to stretch very far. That the child is the Christ child. It is Jesus the Messiah coming into the world. And if the child is the Messiah, then who must the woman be but Israel? That Israel brought the Messiah, brought the child to this world. The faithful people of God who continued to walk in covenant with Him were used of God, promised way back in Abraham's day, were used of God to bring this great blessing to the world. And so here we find this woman. She is in danger. Her child is in danger. And of course, Israel went through many pains, many trials to survive in order to bring about this particular child. The dragon we easily recognize as Satan, and he did all in his power to prevent Jesus from coming. The first thing I thought about was, of course, Herod, when Jesus was around 2 years old, and Herod had tried to have all the boys killed that were in the neighborhood, fearful of this king of the Jews coming into his area. But that was not the only time Satan tried to get rid of Christ. You look at the history of the Hebrews, and there are a lot of times they faced annihilation. When you look at the Exodus, Why did the Exodus take place? Well, it took place because 400 years before, there was a family that was about to starve to death. And had Joseph not been sold down the river by his brothers and been in a place to serve God and to protect them and to feed them, Jacob's family would have been wiped out. And you can go to many other times. You can look at the life of Esther and Haman's plan against the Jews to wipe them out. And we could just start listing the many times things began to conspire against the people of God to get rid of them, not just because they were a hated people, but because Satan was at work trying to get rid of this child coming into the world. So this is just, I think, a very vivid picture of what's happened. Satan tried to destroy Jesus for 33 years, tried to tempt him into sin, all of that time. So he failed in trying to consume the child. You see this drawing also of the 7 heads, the 7 crowns, the 10 horns. And remember, horns are a symbol of strength. Crowns are a symbol of the ability to rule. So this is someone who is a powerful ruler on the earth. Paul calls Satan the ruler of the kingdom of the air. And even Jesus showed that he understood who Satan was and Satan's power on this earth. If you turn to John 12, verses 31 through 33, as Jesus is looking forward to the time when he would be crucified, he says, "Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." So he's talking about Satan being driven out. In other words, he is going to win on the cross. But notice what he calls him, the prince of this world. And so he recognizes that Satan has the ability to rule on earth, at least at this point in time. It also mentions another part of this vision that's interesting, is it says the tail of the dragon swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky. And this seems to be referring to the angels that Satan took with him from heaven in the war described in the following verses. Read 7 through 12 with me. "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows his time is short.'" While this is quite obviously another symbolic vision of spiritual warfare, it may very well be what you and I would consider a historical account of what happened. As Satan is cast out of heaven, Satan was not born in the bowels of hell. Satan was a created being like Michael, like Gabriel, like other angelic creatures. But there was rebellion in his heart, quite obviously. And notice something, and I don't guess until I read Revelation and was looking at this that I realized it, although I had heard this about Satan being cast from heaven before. Michael is not taking a defensive position. Satan's not trying to grab the throne and Michael's fighting him off. Michael starts this fight. It says Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. Who started this? Michael obviously was under orders. Move them out. And this was no small thing. But Michael and those who were with him cast out Satan and those who were with him. Satan was driven out of the heavenly realms. Now, how did that happen? I know, I guess I just visualize almost a physical battle, and the stronger, the purer, or whatever won. But you know what it says here in verse 11? They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. Now, I know as you begin to read that section, there's a lot of what he says that's true of us as saints as well. He doesn't tell us he's completely changed subjects. I have to stop and wonder if the power of what Jesus did on the cross is the power of God, the righteousness of God, to cleanse everything, to purify everything. that even the blood of Christ could reach into the heavenly realms and do spiritual battle against Satan. It seems to me, at least, that's something we have to seriously consider. He talks about one of the names of Satan here in verse 10 when he calls him the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night. That accuser has been hurled down. And I read something, and I put it, I think, in your notes, a quote that I have there from B. Shelburne that has blessed me, and so I wanted to keep it and I wanted to share it. He asked the question, when you think about what Satan does for a living, and that is accuse people, when you live in guilt and accuse yourself rather than accepting the freely offered cleansing of Christ, are you not joining with Satan against yourself? You know, sometimes I think we hold on to guilt because we feel like it's the righteous thing to do. We feel like that we need to be paddled for this, and my mama and daddy aren't here to do it, so I'll just have to do it myself. And so I won't, I know God will forgive me, but I've got to beat myself up just a little bit longer. Who are you in league with? Satan has no right to accuse you. Why would you hand it back to him? If Ron was about to tell you a bad story on me, and he says, no, never mind, do you think I would say, no, go ahead, tell him. Satan is the accuser. God's not going to listen to him. Why should you? Why should I? It doesn't mean that we don't repent of our sins. It doesn't mean we don't recognize our sins. It means we recognize that they are forgiven. That's why we forsake them as a response to the grace of God. But beating ourselves up, trying to do some sort of penance in order to please God won't do. The sacrifice has already been made on the cross. God has already been pleased. And so we cannot get ourselves in league with Satan by being the accuser of the brethren, whether that brother is myself or someone else. So Satan is cast down to the earth. And notice he says, woe to the earth and the sea. I noticed that this time as I was reading through it. We're about to read about a beast coming out of the sea and a beast coming out of the earth. And so I think this is just almost a precursor, a foreshadowing of what is about to come. 13 through 17. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So stop and just notice. There seems like there's a parenthetical statement. Because Satan was after this woman up through verse 6. And now in verse 13, he returns to that scene. And so it's almost like he stepped back and said, oh, by the way, this is where the dragon came from. Now let's return to our story. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now this is where I begin to have this flash of inspiration today. And so, and I told Brian, I said, I went home and pulled my sources out. Did Wilcox say anything about this? No, he didn't say that. Did Barclay? I couldn't find anybody that agreed with me, so it's a little bit scary. So you don't have to agree with me either, all right? But when I thought about it and then I began to think about other passages, I thought I have to at least share it in case this was something that we really do need to think about. Who's the woman? Well, I said it's Israel. It's the faithful people of God. But what happens to the woman? Because it talks about her being cared for. She flees into the desert to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of. This is again verse 6. For 1,260 days. You remember this number? Okay, we know what that is. That's the church age. Now look down in verse 14. It says she will be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time. And this comes directly out of Daniel. A time is a year. So time is 1 year. Times is 2 more years. Half a time, 3.5 years. 42 months. 1,260 days. It's the same thing. So this woman, whomever she is being protected, is being safeguarded by God during this age that we're living in now, during what we typically call the Christian age. And the serpent tries to overwhelm her with a flood. This might be a flood of deceit, a flood of deception. It may be just a word picture that we often see in the Old Testament of being overwhelmed. And that word we can think of it in terms of a flood. But if this is physical Israel, people who have been following God but have not accepted the Messiah, is that possible that that's who He's protecting, that's who He's setting aside, so to speak? You know why this begins to resonate with me, even though I don't really necessarily want it to, because it wasn't the way I preached it last time? It's because when Paul talks in Romans 11 about how we were grafted in as Gentiles, and you hear the love in Paul's heart for Israel, Paul had the very strong belief. When you read from verse 25 on, it seems quite evident. He had the strong belief that toward the end of time, after all the Gentiles have come in, as he says, Israel will return. They've experienced a hardening of heart, he says, a hardening in part, until the Gentiles have come in. But then Israel will return. The phrase he uses, all Israel will be saved. And I think that particular phrase is talking about all of God's people. Gentile or Jew, no matter what their physical lineage, they will all be brought in. But it seemed that Paul was saying that we had the Jewish core here, but when most of them rejected the Messiah, it opened the door for the Gentiles, and this is all God's plan. And then He'll soften the hearts of the Jews toward the end of time, so Jew and Gentile alike become that spiritual Israel God is looking for. And so this woman is being protected. He calls it a place in the desert. That word basically means wilderness. You don't think about it Sahara. You think about a place of separation, somewhat of isolation, and of protection. Wilderness was not always a bad place to be, because that's a place you can be really alone with God. So God can deal with you. God can work with you. God can protect you. I did run across, and I'll share these with you too, just in case it's something for you to think about and pursue. I told you last time about these 42 months being a time of terror and pain, and we look back at what Daniel predicted, and we look at what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. But somebody else, another writer, gave me two more explanations of the 42 months, and this is when the bells really started going off. This I did not know, and I'm ashamed I didn't know it. Did you know there are 42 stages on the journey that Israel made across the wilderness? 42 stops. There's another 42 cropping up. I didn't know that, but I found that in several sources, and that may be another source of this particular number. 42 months is, if you think about it, the approximate time of Jesus' ministry from baptism to ascension. So this phrase 42 months can be talking about coming from a lot of sources. Satan has, and it talks about this flood, he has certainly released a flood of deception. I wondered what it meant, and I still sort of wonder. It says, the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. And I thought, it sounds like the world, the inhabitants of the earth, have swallowed what Satan spews out. How does that protect us? You know, it's not hard to see it if you just take a step away from it. It's easy to see it in the lives of others when they're swallowing the lie. It seems so clear to us that it becomes almost a protection for us when we can see the downfall of the inhabitants of the earth. But Satan, enraged at the woman, can't get to her, and so in verse 17, he went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So Satan has not stopped. Satan is still after the church. The battle still rages on. Chapter 13. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had the feet of those like those of a bear, and the mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne, and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast, and who can make war against him? This beastly picture has a very strong root, a very strong source, and that's from the book of Daniel. Turn to Daniel chapter 7. And I will just tell you in passing, Daniel I have in a way sorely neglected, in part because this series would probably be twice as long if I said everything about Daniel that's connected to Revelation. So I encourage you to read Daniel over the next few weeks or when we get through with this, and you will probably see that book in a way differently than you've seen it before. But Daniel 7, let's read verses 2 through 8. This is Daniel's dream of 4 beasts. And see if some of the descriptions don't sound like what we just read. Beginning of verse 2, Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully." Now, if you're familiar with Daniel, you know what one of the outcomes of this vision is. He is seeing the kingdoms, the major kingdoms of the earth in the future coming to pass. He talks about Babylonia and the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire and finally the Romans. And these descriptors fit very carefully and with that secular history. But if you look at those beasts, you can see portions of all of them wrapped up right here in this beast out of the sea. If you think about all of these secular powers that you see in Daniel, what John is seeing is that this is what this beast is. What it represents is corrupt secular power. These are political powers, governmental authorities perverted by Satan. That's what this composite beast is. He's drawing from the bear and the leopard and the lion and pushing them all together. It represents corrupt secular power. Now, it's God's will there be in law and order. But Satan comes along, not creating anything of his own, but perverting everything that he can, and he creates bad law, and he creates tyrannical order. The dragon had the crowns on its heads. That means he's in charge. Now the beast, I want you to see this. This is a small detail, and with all these figures, it's easy to miss it. But the beast out of the sea, this is again in verse 1, he had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on his horns. Okay, so see these heads, and you've got horns. They don't have to be on the head. That's where I try to put it. But it doesn't say the horns were on the heads. It had horns. Maybe it had horns on its shoulder. I don't know. The point is this. The crowns are not on the head, symbolizing royalty. They're on the horns. What does a horn symbolize? Who remembers? What? Strength. Power. They rule by brute force. Secular power. In other words, the U.S. Army has better weapons than you do. I've got a 20-gauge shotgun and that's it. I'm outgunned. Corrupt secular power can take what it wants by brute force. Ask Rome. They'll tell you. Ask Alexander the Great. He'll tell you. You go back and look at these kingdoms, they didn't negotiate treaties. They took what they wanted. And so this beast out of the sea, corrupt secular power, rules and reigns and destroys simply by brute force. This wasn't hard to see in that day and time. It's not hard to see even now. And it says one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. I don't suspect there's any more to this than the fact that every time we think we have chopped down corrupt secular power, well, we got rid of that guy. Here it comes again. World War I was the war to end all wars. Wasn't it? Evidently not. But that's what we called it back then. Corrupt secular power just keeps rising up from another corner And people keep bowing to it. Who could possibly defeat us now? Who can make war against the great power? That's what they thought in Rome's day. That's what they thought with Alexander the Great, etc., etc. Verse 5, the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. There's our favorite phrase again. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. There's a lot in that section I don't like at all, but I also know it's true. I understand it. He's telling us the truth. God is not sugarcoating anything. This was readily seen in Rome's day. Caesars required that they be worshipped, and obviously they persecuted Christians. I really didn't like it the first time I read that he was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. I thought we were the overcomers. We're talking about corrupt secular power and brute force, and yes, it has had its way in the physical world with Christians. They threw Christians to the lions, to the gladiators, burned them at the stake. All it takes is might. All it takes is military might. And that's what was happening. The inhabitants of the earth worship the beast. But notice, he again is dividing that line in verse 8. The inhabitants of the earth are those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. You're in one place or the other. And verse 9 is just a simple state of fact. Some of us are going to go to jail. Some of us are going to be killed. That is the way it is. And that doesn't mean something went wrong. God told us it was going to happen. This is not heaven yet. We're not there yet. It calls for patient endurance. It calls for faithfulness on our part. Yes, we have to become men and women who will trust God with the heart of Job that says, even if he slays me, I will trust him. That's the kind of heart we need to have. And even if he allows the enemy to do whatever he will do to me, I can still be faithful. I can still endure. That's what we're called to be and called to do. So he's called the beast out of the sea. Now he's calling a beast out of the earth. So his reign over the earth is complete, whether it's on land or on water. 11 through 17. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great and miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. Because of the signs he was given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. He also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. His description, I thought, was very interesting when it said he had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. I saw a lamb and thought, wait a minute, I thought I knew what a lamb was in Revelation. I thought I had that picture already clear. Isn't the lamb Christ? Like a lamb. And once I began to see everything else he said about it, it made perfect sense. He has 2 horns. What's horns? Strength. He had 2 horns like a lamb. So he had strength like, similar to the lamb. And then he begins to say, after all, he could do miraculous signs. He could call down fire from heaven. This sounds a lot like the story with Moses and the Exodus. The magicians could do some of the same things that Moses could do by their magic arts. And so here is a beast that looks somewhat like a Christ figure, but he's got the tongue of a dragon. when you listen to what he says, he's not saying what the Lamb with the capital L is saying. He exercises the authority of the first beast on his behalf. The first beast corrupts secular power, and this beast are together. And both of them bring worship ultimately to Satan, but bring worship to themselves as well. Who is this beast that looks like a lamb, but speaks the words of the dragon, has the miraculous signs? And it also tells us later on that he's connected to commerce, because he talks about doing business down there around verse 16 and 17. This beast is religious compromise. And the more you think about that, I think the more sense it will make to you. Religious compromise. False religion. And don't just put a label on that. Oh, it's those guys. It's those guys. These guys can be found anywhere. Religious compromise. This ultimately serves political power. It ultimately, if you listen to it long enough, you'll find out it's either serving a political agenda, or it's trying to get you to fall down and worship money or fame or worldly influence, whatever makes you popular, whatever makes you happy, serve yourself. This is religious compromise. Why are there so many preachers on TV that are all tied up in the money game? It's not too hard to figure that out. They're trying to get you to worship the first beast, secular power. Do anything but worship the Lamb of God. You can kind of talk that game a little while if you want to, but keep your heart tied up on this world with money, with fame, with worldly influence. As you read what he's saying in Revelation, I think it ties also back to 2 Thessalonians 2. We read a little bit out of 2 Thessalonians last time. I want to revisit that just briefly. 2 Thessalonians 2 verses 9 and 10. As Paul talks here about what he calls the coming of the lawless one. And he says this in 9 and 10, the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with the work of Satan, displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders, and in every sort of evil that deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. I read that last portion because to me it's one of the more important portions of those two verses. He's describing this lawless one. He's describing this power of religious compromise and its ability to sway, and you have to stop and say, how do I defend myself? How do my children defend themselves from being sucked down the stream? Love the truth. Don't come to God saying, I want you to do this for me. Love the truth. Don't go find a church that just makes you happy. Love the truth. That's your defense, because he says that was their cardinal flaw. They fell for the lie because they didn't love the truth. So God has provided a safeguard for us. He has told us what it is. But religious compromise is something that we are having to deal with on this earth. It is the beast of the earth that all of us are going to have to deal with. So just almost like it's corresponding to the Holy Trinity, we have an unholy Trinity of the dragon and the beast of the land and the beast of the sea. Satan, corrupt secular power, religious compromise. Now we just read a few minutes ago also about a mark. In verse 16 again, he forced everyone to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark. First of all, the significance of the mark, notice this, it's on the right hand or the forehead. That means it's a public stance. If it's on your right hand or your forehead, I'm going to see it. So this is not something covert. It's not something that you're going to have tattooed on your thigh so that no one need know. No, it's going to be right there. That's what he's saying. So first of all, this is a public stance. Like the sealing of the saints, they were sealed on their forehead with the name of God. This is a sealing on the forehead. This is, in other words, it is quite clear to God who the inhabitants of the earth are and who the citizens of heaven are. And those who are selling out, following what this beast is forcing them to do, they're making a public stance of it. They're making a decision. And think about the trade guilds of Thyatira as an example, where you had to be in a trade guild just to do business. But that wasn't just paying their dues or their fees. You also had to get involved with the temple prostitution that they supported. And so you had to live an immoral life in order to run a business. And do we just shrug our shoulders and go, well, you got to make a living? Show me in Scripture where it says you got to make a living. I can show you all day long where it says you got to be faithful. It doesn't say you have to survive. I think that was one of the keys to Paul's courage. The man felt like he didn't have to survive. He as much as wrote that. I'd just as soon go home and be with God, but as long as I'm here, I'll serve you. But he didn't have to survive. And once you get to that point, when you say, I don't have to play the game, might I lose my job? Yep. Might I get thrown in jail? Yep. So, weren't you told that? Didn't you get the flyer? We put it out there. It's right here. Some of you are going to die. Some of you are going to prison. We're going to lose some of these physical skirmishes. We might as well prepare ourselves for it. It calls for faithfulness. It calls for endurance. And those who sell out just to make a buck, just to do business, are walking away from God. Now, let me put your mind at ease. No. This is not where they come and sneak a computer chip under your skin that has 3 6s on it. Don't laugh at me. Some people believe that. I know people who won't let them put 666 on their license plate. It has nothing to do with that. This has to do with saying, I'm going to get along. I'm going to make a good living. I'm going to do what that takes. Do I have to compromise? Yeah, I do. He's talking to you if that's your attitude. That's a warning. That is a stern warning from God that we have to wake up and be prepared for that. We can't play that game. We just simply have to trust God. Okay, the last verse, verse 18. I guess let's back up so we'll get it at a run because verse 17 is connected. No one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. There's been a lot written about it, and of course, there's a lot about letters having numerical value. Think about it this way. You can do this with Greek and you can do this with Hebrew. Maybe to oversimplify it, say if you're going to do this in English, where A is 1 and B is 2 and C is 3 and D is 4, then if you're dad, that you would be a 9, right? D, A, D. That's 9. I ran my name. You know what the number is? No, it's not. It's 176, not even close. But you can laugh at that, and I laugh at that because through the centuries, people have been doing that math, trying to figure out who the beast is. And if you get enough of the letters, enough of the numbers, and you look at it this way, and maybe then it must have been this guy in history that he was talking about. That has nothing to do with this. In fact, notice that it says to calculate the number of the beast. It doesn't say figure out the meaning of the number or find a person attached to the number. It doesn't say that. Let's look at it. Let's say it slightly differently. And Wilcock helped me out with the language on this. Let him who has understanding work out a number for the beast. In other words, throughout this whole book, we've been dealing in symbols. Times, time, and half a time. 1,260 days. 3.5 years, 42 months. All these, we're using these numbers to tell a story in a more rich fashion. Well, if we were going to talk about this beast of religious compromise, and we were going to assign him a number instead of a name, what would the number be? That's what he's saying. And then he's going to tell you the answer to that query. He said, it's man's number, it's not God's number. It is 666. In other words, we have become very accustomed in this book to seeing sevens everywhere. Religious compromise comes up short. I don't care if you're in the 1 column or the 10 column or the 100 column. It never gets to 7. It'll always come up short. I don't care how many miracles you can do. I don't care how much money you can get. I don't care how long you can live on this earth because you've played the game. Religious compromise will never get you to the perfection that God has for His people, represented by the number 7. The number 7, we've said, is the essence of a thing, the fullness of a thing. You'll never get there with religious compromise. The number, again, written on the forehead, is an imitation of the sealing of the saints. So you can just almost picture people walking around with numbers on their foreheads and on their hands. And it's not about this magical number. It's just saying, I have sold out. I have decided I need to compromise in order to get along. And they ought to be able to look at their hand and say, there are no sevens there. There's no perfection there. I keep coming up short because this is a number generated by man, not by God. That's the number for religious compromise. Well, this scene, as I said, continues in the next chapter, and we will continue with that next week. Let's close in prayer. Father, we do thank you for these vivid pictures that cement in our minds some eternal truths. No, some of them go right over our heads, and that's just because of who we are. And we have a lot to learn. But Father, some of these things are so vivid, they're hard to forget. And I know that that's one reason that you put them in this fashion. To help us to see that Satan is a dragon, and he tried for centuries in man's history to stop Jesus from coming, and when he couldn't do that, well, he's been chasing us ever since. And so, Father, help us to recognize the dragon is after us, and he has partners in crime. He has the secular state. He has people with power and might, whether they are up in the halls of government or it's our supervisor. There are people that have power, and they will wield it, and they will try to get us to bend our rules, bend your rules to get along. And there's that beast from the land, religious compromise, that's telling you it's really okay. Because after all, you got to make a living. And this still smells a little bit like the religion you know. After all, we've got the signs and wonders and miracles. And Father, it's just a shell game. They keep moving things around. But when everything is revealed, we don't see your hand on it. We see sixes instead of sevens. And we recognize that this is just man playing his games, and those things are destined to destruction. We're glad, Father, that we can see the dragon has already been defeated once as he was cast out of heaven. And his ultimate defeat is coming. It is already sealed. We just have to be patient and faithful as we wait for that day to happen. So help us, Father, to be faithful. It's not always going to be easy. Help us to strengthen one another, to encourage one another, to walk that path together. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.